Ion, thank you for joining us. You are actually one of my heroes. I saw you testify in North Carolina in 2014 about voter suppression in North Carolina, and you kind of blew me away. I describe you as, I refer to you as like the person who knows more about elections, period, than anyone I've ever met. And it's like very obvious that you're really, really passionate from the point of view of just a fan of democracy. And this is not political for you. This is like you're a true believer in democracy. So welcome. Tell us what you're thinking right now, Ion.
Well, I'm looking at across the United States and seeing a lot of good, some bad, and really the elections process that we've had today, despite all of our shortcomings, is probably better than it ever has been. And in fact, that's what I'd like to say first off. That's not to say there are not a lot of problems, and many of the problems, I would say a majority of the problems in our elections process is because we allow the machinations of partisan politicians to run our elections in the United States as opposed to professional election administrators. Mm-hmm. And an example for that is for months, the election officials in the state of Michigan and in Pennsylvania have been asking for more time to process mail ballots, because those states, along with Wisconsin, where they historically had low volume of vote by mail or absentee ballots, their laws limit counting those ballots until election day. That's the first time they can open those ballots. And we have a candidate for running for president who in fact is taking the normal process of vote by mail ballots, which may take a week or longer to fully tabulate. He's turning that around on the process and in some ways saying the process is fraudulent because those ballots aren't tabulated on election day, which quite frankly tells me he knows absolutely nothing about elections. Nothing. In Arizona, you have 21 days to report your results. In Florida, 14 days to finalize the results. In California, 28 days to finalize the results. So in fact, our elections, while the media has kind of poorly informed the public that elections end on election day, that's not been the case in my entire 28 year of administering elections in the county of Leon, which is in Tallahassee, Florida, the capital county. And I can tell you that, so the politicians are trying to scare people, trying to make people doubt that the process is working. That is the same kind of tactic that Russian President Putin is trying to do as well. The issue in an attack, we are under cyber warfare with Russia. It's very clear to me. I was in on a call that was given by the FBI to the state of Florida election officials on September 30th of 2016, where the FBI had told us that in fact, at a vendor doing work in Florida, notice the kind of broad, non-specific language, had been attacked by a foreign entity. They didn't even specify that it was Russia, but those of us in the room knew that. And it remained until Reality Winter revealed that information through the intercept tapes that she released as a private contractor working for the National Security Administration. And for revealing to the United States public that Russia had attacked the United States, she was charged with violations of the Espionage Act and is now serving 5 years in prison for revealing to the citizens that in fact we had been attacked and counties had been successfully penetrated in the state of Florida. And to this day, Annabelle, we do not know the extent of the attack. What was the remediation to the attack? Certainly Russia knows, but no election official in the state actually knows, because that information was withheld from us by Homeland Security. What I consider a
Wow.
very, very odd situation. The people that need
Oh,
to know
okay. So
about
wait,
this
Ion,
kind of
let me
thing
stop you.
are
Let me
election
stop you for a
officials.
second. Let me stop you for a second. Okay, because my blood pressure is going up right now. So, so I'm gonna stop you for a second. Take a breath, because I'm getting scared right now. So, Ion, one, you started out by saying you're not that worried, but now you just said something that sounds really scary. So, like, how do you reconcile the two?
Well, because I think the attacks were designed to essentially throw us into a state of insecurity, to
Hmm.
try to get us to like, oh my God, what's going on? In fact, what this did is spur the United States to spend quite a bit of money on hardening our intelligence. And what most people don't realize is those same servers that the GRU, which is the modern day equivalent of the KGB in Russia, the United States in the November 2018 election unleashed a computer cyber weapon that we have, and we fried all their servers on election day, so they couldn't repeat what they did in 2016 and 2018. So we did respond in 2018 by essentially in making the servers that were responsible for the attacks, Cozy Bear and one other entity, we basically rendered them inoperative. So again,
Hmm.
I don't know what we're going to do in 2020, but we have the capacity to essentially render any websites that are essentially trying to penetrate our system. Basically, we can destroy those computers. We can destroy those servers. Whether or
Okay.
not we will or not, I don't know. I don't have access to what the federal government agencies in this arena are doing. But whatever they did in 2018 apparently worked, because we didn't have the same kind of penetrations that we had in 2016, which
Hmm.
were across the entire nation. I mentioned that Florida was successfully penetrated. The Senate intelligence report that came out on this issue indicated that all 50 states were probed. All 50 states.
Probed.
So again,
Can you break that
this is
down?
the in other words, now what was probed were the voter registration systems,
Okay.
not the vote tabulation systems. So right off the bat, these attacks, we don't know directly hit any voting machines. But one of the things that we can be aware of in 2020 is they can affect things like voting by mail, because all the voting by mail procedures are generally controlled not by vote tabulation software, but by the voter registration software, which is integrated in the vote by mail programs. So for example, if you're registered to vote, the same fields will allow you to get access to your address where your vote by mail ballot will be delivered, for example. So one of the things that we have to be aware of is watching the level of misdirected mail that will be involved in the vote by mail process. And that can be
Okay.
monitored. One of the
So,
things that we're doing in Florida and in many states is monitoring the amount of ballots that are being tabulated in counting. You can
okay.
go to North Carolina, for example, you can go to Florida and actually find out today how many vote by mail ballots have been received and how
Hmm.
many of them are counted. And we can
Okay.
do a descending analysis to determine are vote by mail ballots being affected or not. So again,
Okay.
for every potential problem, there is potential ability to identify. And again, in Florida, for example, we vote on hand-marked paper ballots. We also, for example, won litigation in this state that required that all voting machines have to keep the digital image that they captured in order to use to count. The actual voting machines, even though you're voting on paper ballots, capture an image digitally, and
Hmm.
that's what they tabulate to figure out your votes. So you can protect the process by, on election night, capturing original photographs of the printouts of the poll tapes in every voting machine. And that's what, frankly, I'm proposed and involved in efforts to do to, for example, in each of the critical battleground states, make sure that the poll tapes, which are printed from the optical scan machines, which are receiving the ballots, are recorded before they're transmitted over the internet to central tabulation units. Because in fact, that is an insecure connection. Anyone who is using a digital or Wi-Fi transmitter, and many jurisdictions across this data state do, those can be intercepted by devices, common devices like, for example, Stingray, which is not only available to law enforcement, but available to members of the public. So again, there are lots of threats. The more technology you introduce into the process, the more you make the process open to penetration and attacks. But individuals who are aware of the elections process can identify where these gaps are and then do safeguards. So for example, one of the safeguards against interfering or manipulation of the data by wireless transmission is to secure the actual documents before they make the transmission over the internet. So again, that's something that I and a number of groups are dedicated to doing this election. I just got off another Zoom conference before yours, basically looking at the different groups that are right now participating in this. And it's a broad number of groups, cross sections of not only individuals who are concerned about elections, but people who recognize that institutional racism is part and parcel of the problems that we have in the elections field. So this year we've got individuals from civil rights organizations and fraternities and sororities, which heretofore have not been very active in the election integrity arena, and they're coming in right now. And so that's a welcome addition to this endeavor.
Okay, so let me sort of help process some of this information, because that's a lot of information. I think what people are trying to figure out right now is, what is the safest way for me to vote? So I'm in Pennsylvania right now, and I can't figure out what is the best way for me to vote. You know, whether I should trust mail-in ballot, should I go in and do in-person absentee, should I wait until election day? We don't have official early voting. I just feel like I'm just nervous about not being able to have my ballot count. Should we be worried about mail-in ballots?
Well, I think you should be worried if you don't mail them back early. That is a concern. One of the things that we're seeing is taking more than 2 weeks in some cases for vote by mail ballots to be delivered by the United States Postal Service. That is dangerously too late to one of the what I call electric rails, that if you touch, your ballot is electrocuted, which is in the state of Pennsylvania. And by the way, there's an excellent site for any citizen who wants to know about the rules in their state. Stephen Colbert released it the other day. It's called Better Know a Ballot. Better Know a Ballot. With one click, I can go to Pennsylvania, find out they don't have early voting, find out what the rules are for early voting. And right off the bat on that site, it tells you that there's a critical element that you've got to be aware of if you're voting by mail in Pennsylvania. Did you know that you have to put your ballot inside the secrecy sleeve before you put it into the final mailing app? Because if you don't, they won't count that ballot. That's called a naked ballot under the jargon. But again, those are the kinds of things to be aware of. Have you ever? So you must have read the rules or have voted by mail in the past. Is that correct?
No, I'm new to Pennsylvania. I'm from Virginia, but I've been reading and reading and reading over the rules, and I just keep learning all these details. Voter. I'm trying.
Well, it keeps changing. It keeps changing. I will tell you that September 19th, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court issued a ruling saying that drop boxes could be used. This afternoon, I have on my Twitter account broadcast all the vote by mail drop boxes, which Philadelphia plans to distribute. And I will tell you that I'm immunocompromised. Unfortunately, I cannot deliver my ballot in person. But what I did in Florida is one of the things that I recommended, and I'm going to put a big caveat, which I'll come back to. But I received my vote by mail ballot, marked it, and then I drove to the nearest vote by mail drop box and dropped it off. Those ballots are collected nightly. So within 48 hours, I was able to go to my local supervisor of elections. That's what we call them in Florida, supervisors. I went to the local elections office website and I found 48 hours that my ballot had been received, verified, and tabulated and counted. No worry. And now that you have this Supreme Court ruling from the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, there are these drop boxes all across. I sent 2 tweets out, one covering the ballot boxes that are going to be in the Philly area and the ballot boxes that are going to be in the Valley area, in the more rural areas. So again, you can in fact receive a vote by mail ballot, mark it, take it to one of these drop boxes and drop it. Now you don't have to worry about whether or not the post office is going to deliver it on time or will accidentally have it chewed up in one of their conveyor belts, which I've seen happen. And that would give you probably the highest. Oh, yes. In our office, we used to have specimens of absentee ballots that were destroyed by voting machine processing devices. They're high-speed machines. And if they accidentally slip and get caught in the chains or the ball bearing systems, they can destroy a vote by mail ballot. And the post office will deliver it to us, but they're shreds at that point. We have to contact the voter and say, we need to get you another ballot quickly.
Right. So let me ask you something. Okay. Part of the difficulty right now is feeling like we're being targeted with voter suppression. Do you think this is like active voter suppression for political gain, or do you think it's just sloppiness?
No, it's been going on for a long time. Most of your callers might not recognize the name, but those of us, the people who have been into politics a long time, might know the name of Richard Viguerie, who developed, quite frankly, one of the largest vote by mail houses for the Republican Party. And he was famously quoted in a speech that he gave to a Republican organization, basically saying, "We don't want people to vote. That does not serve our interests." So when you hear things like voting doesn't make a difference, you're voting for the lesser of two evils, those are actually long-time voter suppression tools used by partisan to make people feel like voting doesn't matter. You shouldn't vote. It doesn't do any good. And quite frankly, these are so, they're almost time-honored memes at this point. And these are completely false, because I can give you example after example after example where people have been killed for registering people to vote, particularly in Florida and across the South, where I've been a resident now for some 50 years. Voter suppression, though, is not limited to the South. Voter suppression is simply what a political campaign does to ensure that their opponent doesn't want to vote. And if they don't vote, then they need fewer votes to win on their side. So voter suppression, unfortunately, has been part of the American political process, quite frankly, for as long as I can remember. And as a student of history, and I've taught a course on the history of voting at Florida State University, we've never we're about as honest as we've ever been now. And that's not saying a whole lot. For example, if you remember that Lyndon Baines Johnson was elected on his second time to Congress, and that many people complained that he was elected by the names of people on their tombstones, and it's true. But you have to remember that in fact, the local elections commissioner was in
Right.
on this gambit. Those ballots that were forged were driven to his office by the Texas Highway Patrol. The local highway patrol was in on the fraud. So again, there's been local levels of fraud in lots of
Right.
areas. In Kentucky, voting machine technicians who were manning touchscreen voting machines were paid by a sheriff to basically misinform voters how to cast votes on touchscreen voting machines. And after they left, the actual voting attendants would actually erase the vote and cast it for the sheriff's candidate.
Right.
So again,
Okay.
we're human beings are not perfect. The
Okay.
fraud that I see and where we need to look at is at the local level. Now,
Wait a
and I
second.
will
Hold on a
tell you
second.
that we can catch it.
Hold on a second. When you say local level, you're talking about like county level, you're talking about state level or precinct
I'm talking
level,
about a county level.
county level? Okay.
Look what happened in the North Carolina absentee ballot situation that led to another election in a congressional race. An individual paid someone to collect absentee ballots from people and essentially mark them with the wrong candidate. I can tell you that that same ploy goes all the way back to the colonial period, where the parties and candidates actually manufactured the little vote slips that, in fact, they would tell individuals, this vote, who are you for? And the person would say, okay, this is the one that you need to put in your box. And actually, it would be for the other candidate. And because oftentimes a number of the voters during the colonial period couldn't read. And so essentially there was lots of fraud relative to political party machinations. So the partisan attacks, partisan use of the laws goes all the way back to the beginning of this nation, Annabelle. And our national laws are likewise twisted by things like slavery. That's why we have an electoral college and why we have no universal right to vote for the office of the presidency and vice presidency in Congress. I can tell you, as the election official who was appointed by the Florida Supreme Court, for example, to oversee the 2000 election, the reason that the US Supreme Court could prevent Florida from counting all the votes, and that's exactly what they did. We never counted the overvotes. And in every election, it's standard operating procedure in a recount to recount the overvotes and the undervotes. Florida's overvotes were never recounted because the United States Supreme Court froze our recount before it could go any further. And the reason it could do that is you and I do not have a constitutional right to vote for the presidency. There is no language in the United States Constitution saying that.
Okay, let me just clarify a few things. Okay, one is, well, let me just ask you straight up. Who won the 2000 election?
Well, the courts awarded George Bush the election, but the media recount of all of the ballots that was conducted by a consortium of media, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Miami Herald, what they found was that if Florida had been allowed to do a full recount, counting the overvotes and undervotes, Gore would have won the election by 171 votes, instead of Bush being declared the winner by 537. And I'll tell you where the error was, where the overvote was. What an investigative reporter for the Orlando Sentinel, David Damron, discovered that the counties in the state of Florida were using differing standards to tabulate an overvote. An overvote is legally defined when you vote for more candidates that are legally allowed to be voted for in an election. So if you vote for two different candidates, that vote is thrown out as an overvote. And in the state of Florida in the 2000 election, 21 counties did that, or 31 counties properly recognized that that was an overvote and threw out that ballot. What was not discovered was thousands of voters across the state of Florida did this. And they either voted for Bush or they voted for Gore. And then at the bottom of the 10 candidate list for president, Annabelle, there was a line that said, write in candidate. So thousands, literally tens of thousands of voters would write in the same name in that line. So they would write Bush, they'd vote a cast for Bush, then they would write in Bush. They would do Gore, and then they'd write in Gore. Those are not overvotes, because that's only voting for one candidate in the race. But 36 of Florida's 67 counties threw all those votes out. They threw them out as overvotes because they saw this person is voting for 2 votes in a race that only should have 1 vote. And that's not how you should have looked at it. It should have been 2 candidates in which only 1 candidate. And so they incorrectly threw out those votes. But because the US Supreme Court froze Florida's recount just as it started, we never went through the overvotes.
Okay.
And
so wait a second.
Therein lies the tail.
So did Florida figure out how to prevent this kind of error, this problem?
Yes, we started training the canvassing boards. We wrote a clear set of guidelines for the canvassing board and how ballots. See, one of the problems is until you run into a problem, you don't know, you don't have rules to cover it. We never trained the 3-member canvassing boards in the state of Florida on how to do their job. There was no formal training. So you had a county commissioner and a judge who never dealt with election issues. And so it looked to them like, well, there's 2 votes here and there only need to be 1, so we'll toss it out. We trained them now. We actually bring all of the election officials, the county judges who are serving on the canvassing boards, the other members of the canvassing board. We actually have a major conference in January of the year and bring in all of these members and educate them to what the election law is. We didn't do that in 2000. And unfortunately, it cost us a president.
Yeah. So
and may have altered the course of American history.
So do you think that this kind of training you're talking about, do you think this kind of training is taking place around the country or no? Because when I hear about these errors, and also just looking at the complexity of election laws in some place like Pennsylvania, I mean, there's so much room for things to go wrong. I mean, there's just so many details. Like I actually corrected a lawyer yesterday who thought he knew everything about mail-in ballot, but he actually had a little detail wrong that I was able to catch because I've been doing all this research. And so I'm just wondering, like, why can't we train people better? Why is it so haphazard?
Well, because we don't have any kind of uniformity in the United States. Again, going back to the fact that the representatives from the slave states that attended the Philadelphia Conference in 1787 would allow no discussion on universal manhood suffrage to take place because they were deathly afraid that eventually African Americans would achieve this, i.e. they're slaves. And so there was absolutely no major discussion on universal manhood suffrage that was allowed to occur at the Philadelphia. So essentially what we had was every election was left up solely to the states. Well, you have some states that run it on a nonpartisan, excellent basis. Colorado, Oregon, Washington, excellent voting jurisdictions. And you have some states that are quite frankly, completely not aware of how to do a proper election because they've never been stressed. They've never had the kind of close election with a microscope focused on them to realize, hey, you've got some major deficiencies here. For example, going back to something that's occurring right now, I think Pennsylvania was asked to produce its vote by mail procedures. What counts as a vote in Pennsylvania? Well, basically, they don't have a single document with an illustration showing every valid vote and what's not a valid vote. Florida does have that. We realized after the 2000 election that we needed specific standards and basically not only in statute, but with graphic images, so that in fact, no election official would have to essentially say, well, is this a vote or isn't it? And in fact, our laws now would in fact catch the error made in 2000. Every vote would have been legitimately counted. But Pennsylvania doesn't have those optical scan standards. Georgia doesn't have those optical scan standards, primarily because they haven't gone through this kind of fire that the state of Florida has. And until you really run into that concrete wall, you really don't know, oh my gosh, I needed to have done this or this. It's so, basically humans don't really do anything until they have to do it. It's as simple as that. Florida had to do this, and the rest of the nation not, for the most part.
So you're saying to me that we're not going to get DeSantis basically colluding with Trump in order to steal the election in Florida this year?
I believe that what Trump is doing is raising fear. And he would like this to go to the courts to decide. But basically, Florida has a process that eventually he had to recognize, because every Republican candidate running in this state uses vote by mail ballots, that our process really has been fine-tuned since we introduced no fault or no excuse voting since 2002. A number of states, for example, are going to no excuse voting now. They don't have the procedures to do that. Those states are going to have problems on election day and afterwards. That problem does not exist in Florida. Florida will be able to have all of their cast vote by mail ballots, which right now, as of today, September 26th, is about almost 5 million are going in the mails as you and I speak. We can actually have that capacity for processing them because our law allows us to start processing those vote by mail ballots some 26 days ahead of the November 3rd election. So we're going to be processing all of the ballots that come in contemporaneously. And so actually the only votes that we'll have outstanding on election day are those that are being delivered by the post office on election day. So Florida will be able to tabulate all of its votes and have them in by November 3rd. It might be a late night, but they'll all be tabulated by the November 3rd deadline. And so the issue that he's raising about these vote by mail ballots, they shouldn't count after election day. And of course, he doesn't want them to count on election day because the last jurisdictions to turn in their votes are the biggest ones. The biggest ones are where? In the biggest city. And the biggest cities are dominated by a more Democratic minorities-oriented vote. So obviously, he's saying this for a political purpose, but all of the laws in these states allow for the processing of these ballots after the election day as the normal course of operation. So I think it's going to be hard for him developing a successful attack when in fact, these are in fact the state sanctioned rules, as opposed to Florida in 2000, which didn't have specific rules and people went in all kinds of crazy directions.
Okay, so snapshot of 2018 election in Georgia. What happened there? Did Brian Kemp steal that election, in your opinion, to be governor?
I don't think the election was fair. It's very clear, for example, that while he was Secretary of State, he refused to validly register tens of thousands of Georgia citizens who were African American. He illegally used his authority as Secretary of State to interfere in the elections process while he was seeking the office for governor. And this should be a good example. While we should have a rule that if you are the chief election official in your state and you're running for office, you need to recuse yourself from that operation. The temptation to use your authority to essentially gain a personal benefit, that temptation needs to be removed from the public official. I would even
Yeah.
tell you, for example, that a president that I admire, Abraham Lincoln, essentially during the Civil War, for everyone's information, that's when voting by mail or the first absentee ballots were developed so that soldiers' ballots could be counted in their elections. And the election of 1864 was suspected to be a squeaker with a former highly respected general, General McClellan, seeking to take the presidency away from Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln actually moved armies of the North into the border states because the law would allow those army ballots to be counted in the state jurisdictions in which they were cast. So
Right.
essentially, the president was moving armies around to make sure that he would carry the border states and win. Now, it turned
I
out he
see.
didn't need to do that. He ended up winning in a landslide. But again, when you can do something and you have the power to essentially alter the outcome to election to benefit you, all too often we see now that partisans do that. And unfortunately, I think that the Georgia election for governor was not fair simply because of the issue of citizens who are not allowed to register to vote when they should have been. It was one of the ugliest partisan elections I've ever witnessed myself outside of Florida.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I was on a call with you the other night, and you said there were 3 states that worried you in this election. And I believe you said it was Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Michigan. Is that right?
Yes. These are the states that worry me the most. North Carolina has a Republican legislature, Democratic governor, and split boards, and they have a very, very difficult time with this kind of parochial, partisan board arriving at things that are fair. For example, how to tabulate the votes. Those, again, determined at the local level. And you have laws that really limit, for example, common sense applications of law. For example, let's talk about your secrecy sleeve law in Pennsylvania. Whose right to secrecy is that law designed to protect? It's the voter.
Voters.
All voters' rights are personal to them and can be waived by the voter. For example, under Florida, we urge people to put it in the secrecy sleeves, but if a citizen doesn't want to put it into the secrecies, they can waive their right to privacy. And who am I to say, oh, well, you have to vote it in this particular way, so you have a right to privacy? Excuse me, that individual explicitly and implicitly is waiving their right from an election worker potentially seeing their vote when they don't put it in the secrecy sleeve. That's all they're doing. And they have the right to do that under Florida law, but that same voter, having voted in that same way for years in Florida, if they tried to do that in Pennsylvania, that ballot's going to be thrown out. And that makes no sense at all. And quite frankly, if you think about it, this truly is an equal protection argument, the kind that the Republicans tried to raise successfully in Bush v. Gore. Oh, well, not every county is counting all the ballots the same way, so it's a violation of equal protection. Well, excuse me, when you have 2 states treating citizens differently, isn't that an equal protection violation? And even going further, isn't it an equal protection violation to allow voters in the same standings vote by mail ballot counting in one jurisdiction and not in another? Again, on my Twitter account, I tweeted a story coming out of Wisconsin where 2 elderly ladies voting by mail both wrote letters saying, I can't vote because I'm afraid of COVID. And in one jurisdiction, they counted that vote by mail ballot. And then in the neighboring county, they didn't. That is an equal protection violation. And that's because of poor training of election officials on a central basis. We learned in Florida after 2000, we had to bring in all the parties together and train them together all at the same time. So everybody was on the same page. They've not done that in Wisconsin. They haven't done that in Pennsylvania. They don't do that in North Carolina. These are all three critical battleground states. And quite frankly, everybody's votes needs to count the same in order to have a fair election. And that's my goal. I don't care who wins. I want everybody's legal vote to count. It's as simple as that. And we're far away from that where we are today.
Okay, so I know that you're nonpartisan. I'm not trying to pressure you into saying anything that you don't want to say, but as you have pointed out, you know, it is in the Republican Party's interest to have lower turnout, right? They win when there's lower turnout. Democrats win then when there's higher turnout. So Republicans use voter suppression tactics in order to suppress the vote so that they can win, right? That's a fact, isn't it?
Yes, that's a fact. In my opinion, that's an uncontroverted fact. For example, not allowing someone who fears of dying by going to the polls the right to vote by mail.
Right.
And a number of Republican legislatures have said, oh no, fear of death of in-person voting is not a reason to vote by mail. Well, excuse me, what is?
Okay, so let me ask you something. Okay, so I'm working with a team of people to try to help protect the votes. I'm working with Lulu, whom you know, and Harvey Wasserman, and some other people. We're trying to figure out like what can we do as citizens to not only vote responsibly and carefully, but also to volunteer to help other people to make sure that their votes get counted, right? And it's daunting because there's just so much to do. So what do we do?
Well, I would say, the very first thing I would do is ensure we have enough individuals working the polls so that when the voters come to vote on election day or early voting, they won't have to stand in long lines, and subject to the kinds of things that long lines do. Long lines can make people irritable. Long lines in and of themselves can be a form of voter suppression, because if you have a line long enough, people will, you know, I've got my kids, I've got to pick them up. I can't stay in line, and they leave. If you have a long enough line, that is in itself a form of voter discrimination and suppression. And quite frankly, there is an excellent set of recommendations done by nonpartisans that already exists. There's an elections crisis team that has put out nonpartisan recommendations. It's called the Elections Crisis Management Team, I believe. And these are groups of really the best minds around the country that some are election officials, some are not election officials, they're computer scientists. And right off the bat, their number one recommendation is, where possible, voters should use physical, in-person early voting. Now, you can't do that in Pennsylvania because your state does not offer that.
Right.
But in many states, that is really the best way to do that. 3 weeks of early voting, for example, in North Carolina, 2 weeks in Florida. And basically the first week of early voting is not well attended. So you can actually in person, and that's why I'm recommending, for example, younger Americans, students, people that have never voted by mail and are unsure about the process, can actually simply kind of make a hybrid vote by mail early voting process by essentially, when you receive your vote by mail ballot, take it down to your elections office and drop it off there. Don't put it in the mail, or at one of the drop boxes that you have available. Then you can basically monitor to see whether your vote is accepted. Now, if your vote is not accepted, don't panic, because in most jurisdictions, unfortunately, not all, there's a process called a cure provision, which is simply another word for a fix. In Florida, for example, 2/3 of the reasons why vote by mail ballots are not counted is they're received after the deadline. 7 p.m. in
Mhm.
Florida on election day, 8 p.m. in Pennsylvania on election day. Those are the deadlines. But all of the rest of the errors are generally caused because your signature doesn't match in somebody's opinion, the signature that you sign on the outside of that envelope. And let me tell you, that is critical. You must always put a signature on the outside of that mailing envelope, because if they don't have a signature, they can't verify your vote. And
Right.
they're supposed to contact you to give you a chance to correct this. But if you wait until the last second to send that ballot in, you may not get contacted. So
Right.
another good thing is
So-
get that vote by mail ballot dropped off
Right.
early. Get it
Okay.
off 2 weeks before the election at the elections
Okay.
office, so
Okay,
that
so
you
let me
can
just-
receive any
Right.
notice that there's a problem.
Okay, so let me go over some basic ways to avoid having your ballot thrown out. One is deadline. Make sure you get things in on time. Number 2, make sure you sign the mail-in ballot. Okay. Now, in many cases, you have to have signatures that match what's on file, right?
That
So
is
if there's
correct.
a mismatch of signatures, then that could also be a problem that requires curing, right? So I don't know how many
1/3 of all
states.
of the rejected ballots in Florida have that problem.
So in Florida, signatures have to match. And so what's on file, is that what's on your driver's license or state ID?
No, what's on file is what you signed when you originally registered to vote on the voter registration application.
So
And
you don't have a
one of
record
the-
of that. Yeah.
That is correct. And you can't get a record in that unless you physically go to that office, because voter signatures are protected nationally. I can't ask for the Supervisor of Elections to send me a copy of my signature on my voter registration application. They won't do it. They'll let me walk in and physically do it. But here's what you can do. And this is what I recommend if you really seriously want to vote by mail in Pennsylvania. And that is, I've been to the Pennsylvania website, which by going to Better Know a Ballot, I hit Pennsylvania and I hit voter registration, and I found the Pennsylvania voter registration application online. It's online with a place to update your signature. You can actually print out that form, check that box, signature update, put in the signature that you're now using, mail it back to the office. That's the signature that your mail ballot will be verified against. So you have the ability to update your signature in Pennsylvania. That's the same process we use here in Florida. In Florida, you simply go to the website, an online statewide voter registration website, download the form, check update my signature, mail it back to the office, or drop it off at the elections office. And again, that is the signature. Now, if you don't do that and your ballot is flagged in Florida, all you'd have to do is take a picture of your driver's license with your signature and sign an affidavit saying, hey, this is me, and here's my signature and my driver's license with my picture. And if you email that or fax that or mail it back, you don't actually have to appear in person to cure or fix that deficiency, and your ballot will count. So again, you don't have to panic, but you don't want to wait until you're close to the election, because I can tell you, election officials will be swamped on election day. They'll be swamped. You can't do this cure provision on election day and hope to get through. And then you have to make sure that your state has a period of time after the election to do that.
Right. So my understanding is state of Pennsylvania no longer requires signature verification because there was a lawsuit. And so you can actually, in fact, have missing signatures, mismatched signature. They were still counted. even though the big problem is the naked ballot, as we already discussed. Okay, so going back to my list, so signature. There's the signature issue that gets ballots thrown out in some places. There's the secrecy envelope. Other than Pennsylvania, are there other states that require that envelope, that secrecy envelope?
Well, not only that, they will require that you have a signed witness and the address. And if there's anything wrong with the signature of the witness, or they didn't put their address because the witness has to put an address, then the ballot won't count either.
Which states?
That's Tennessee. That's Alabama. Those are states that actually require witnesses, not only your signature, but somebody else's signature. Alaska, they require a witness in Alaska. So again, every state is different. And like you've done, I would urge anyone who plans to vote by mail, first thing you've got to do is read the rules. Again, I'm going to mention that site again. Better Know a Ballot. Steve Colbert's site gives you access to the rules of all 50 states in a simple format, telling you whether you can vote early, whether there's online registration or not. For example, your deadline to register to vote in Pennsylvania is October 19th. If you're not registered to vote by October 19th, you can't request a vote by mail ballot. You can't go and vote in person. So that's the very first deadline for Pennsylvanians to realize that, in fact, if you want to have a say in governing how your life will be conducted, you need to register by October the 19th.
Okay.
We hadn't even talked about that rule, because that's changed in every state. Some states allow election day registration. You can actually go to the polls, bring identification, register, and vote. And those are the states that have the highest vote turnout in the country if they have same day registration. Again, your state and my state require people to be registered out 30 days from the election. So Florida has the same deadline as Pennsylvania, October 19th, to register to vote.
Okay. So there, let me just go over, again, I'm just trying to help people avoid getting their ballots thrown out. So there's the witness situation. In North Carolina, there's also, you need a witness, right, for the mail-in ballots, which is, it's scary because it's such an important battleground state. There's the signature issue, especially in Florida. And then there's the people missing deadlines. And then there's a secrecy ballot. So, okay, so those are like some of the common reasons why ballots get thrown out, right? Did I miss anything?
Yes. No.
Okay.
Those are, you pretty much encapsulate all of the potential problems pretty well.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, now, in terms of working at the polling station, so there's the poll worker. Do you know if there are a lot of people signing up to work as poll workers, or is there a massive shortage right now?
It depends on the location. There are plenty of places where there are enough workers, but there are many where they are not. And what I would, there's a wonderful organization called the Poll Worker Hero Project, Poll Worker Heroes. And quite frankly, they are. To me, the poll workers are the gatekeepers of democracy. Having worked in elections for 28 years, the best way to ensure that we have fair elections is to have citizens who care about their fellow citizens to basically work the polls. And you are paid to do that. I would tell you one of my biggest gripes that I hear is when people are saying, we need people to volunteer for the polls. Excuse me, people, they're not volunteers. Every worker at an early voting site, every worker working behind the polls that checks your IDs, that gives you your proper ballot, that admits you to put it in the optical scanner, every one of those people are paid positions, every one of them. And quite frankly, in some of those jurisdictions, I've seen them add bonuses because they're desperately in need of individuals. What I would do, if you want to work the polls, I would go to the Poll Worker Hero Project, and they will take your information and they will direct you to the critical needs around the country. So that's a great site. The Poll Worker Hero Project was actually started in Princeton, New Jersey, and is also out of Denver, Colorado. And they're an excellent organization and can assist getting people signed up and directing them to where we need workers. I can't give that information off the top of my head because every place is different. For example, in Leon County, Florida, which is Tallahassee, we have plenty of workers with 400 in reserve. And by the way, there needs to be reserve workers because in Tampa, for example, in the primary, 500 workers quit the week before the election. So they're not only do they need to train workers, they need to train backups. So on election day, if somebody doesn't feel good, they're going to call in and say, I'm not coming in. The election office has to call somebody instantly to get in there. Individuals who work the polls are required to be trained. The training can run anywhere between 1 to 3 hours. In Florida, that training, even if you're not selected to work the polls, but if you go to the training, you're paid for that training. Again, these people are not volunteers. And I get aggravated when I hear people say we need people to volunteer. No, the same way people don't volunteer to work in fire departments or volunteer to be nurses. They're staff. Those are workers hired to do a job, and they need to be trained to do it well in order to make it work. They are the gatekeepers of democracy. So if you're concerned about being treated well, I have a suggestion. Get trained, be on the other side of that table, and you can make sure that your vote will count and your friends and neighbors will be processed properly. And that's the kind of civic engagement that I believe in. Working the polls, that's number one. Number two would be, in fact, talking to your groups that are interested in protecting the election. Leaving aside the partisan groups, there are a number of different groups, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, different advocacy groups all across the country. And I don't want to get into naming any particular ones because I'm going to overlook some for sure. But again, all you have to do is go to Facebook, go to Twitter, and you can find out where some of these groups are, as a matter of fact. They're all across the country. People are concerned about their elections. But I would say don't do it with a sense of fear. Do it out of a sense of, in fact, you're taking a proactive step to make sure that this process works properly. Fear is what the people who are trying to upset the election, that's what they're trying to induce in that process. In fact, standing up and protecting the elections is a courage-inducing process from my perspective.
Okay, so I'm trying to summon courage to deal with people showing up at polling stations with guns, because this just happened in Virginia, in Fairfax County. And I mean, it's going to happen in other places. So like, what do you recommend that we do when people show up with guns?
Well, actually, there are voter protection applications. I saw one today called, for example, it's called Democracy Lab is producing it. It's called See Something, Say Something. It's an app that if you click, you're immediately connected to lawyers who specifically our expertise is voter protection, and they can get security out there instantly, because that's exactly what happened in Virginia. Security was called in, and they made that group move from where they were trying to block the entrance of the early voting station. You need to understand that the authorities, election officials, they are not particularly happy with these kinds of events because that upsets voters. And so they're not going to be amenable to individuals trying to intimidate you. And if you feel intimidated by voting, that gives you the ability to act to basically bring in law enforcement, to contact voter protection, to contact the people who operate the polling place and express the fear of intimidation. What we don't want you to do is be quiet and just take it. We're beyond that. We need to act affirmatively to protect the voters. And if you see something, say something. And that app exists. I will tell you that after we're done, I'll email you that app. But that app is going to be monitored by the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, other lawyers, other voter protection groups, Mainline, and the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights. Basically, this app, which we are going to promote, would allow everyone to instantly get security and protection on their side. And that's the kind of action that we need. Citizens, if you fear when you go to vote, that's wrong. And we need to protect you, and we need to do that immediately.
Okay, so the other thing that scares me is Trump deciding that he's not going to concede. He's more or less threatened to not go peacefully, and then all hell breaks loose. What do you think? What do you think we should do if that happens? Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, I think he wants to create that fear in people's minds now. And no less a prestigious journal as the Washington Post 3 days ago did an article saying that courts, that's his plan. He wants to get this into the courts. But getting into the courts is really based on the belief that he can cause enough chaos in the vote by mail ballots and chaos at the polls on election day, with long lines and people not being able to cast their votes and people becoming fearful and going away. He's hoping that he can essentially freeze the election with these false claims of voter fraud. Basically, that's what he's attempting to do. I don't think he can be successful. One, if we get enough people to work the polls, his ploy completely falls. And again, he put this plan together shortly after the Wisconsin primary. And if you can remember the Wisconsin primary, that's where the partisan Republican legislature took away the citizens' abilities to vote by mail after the governor had given the citizens the ability to vote by mail in a pandemic. So again, a clear example of voter suppression, which was then upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, which was saying that's their state procedure. We don't want to interfere. Their procedure trumps our procedure. Right. And again, so the citizens couldn't vote by mail, and they did not have enough staff to open polling places. I believe in Green Bay, they went from 200 polling places to one. In Milwaukee, they went from 400 to 5. Why? They didn't have enough poll workers to process the voters that showed up at the polls. And much of what this fear mongering that Trump is doing is based upon playing that same scenario out across all of the United States urban areas. So those same kind of 7-hour lines are going to be not only in Milwaukee this time, but Miami and Philadelphia and Durham, in New York City, in Cleveland, in Columbus, Ohio. That's what he's planning, which is why if you really want to protect the election, you can get and you'll make sure that your vote will count because you're an election worker and they collect that vote by mail early. In fact, they collect your vote by mail ballots at the training sessions. So your vote is in and clocked before the election has even begun. Right. If you want to protect the election, offer your services to work as an election poll worker to make sure you don't have to deal with war, conflict. All you have to do is read driver's licenses and pieces of paper and computer screens. That's all the danger that you're likely to run into. And I will tell you that elections officers have spent millions on protection, millions. They've got sanitizers. They've got the same kind of plastic barriers that you run into now at the banks and the grocery stores. They've got sanitizers. They've got free masks for most jurisdiction. If you want a mask, they'll give you a free mask. But probably, and all the election workers will be wearing masks. But the voters are not required to wear masks in order to vote in person. Unless you have a specific order like that, I'm not aware of states that are requiring all voters have to wear masks. But I am aware of in most jurisdictions, all election workers have to wear masks for their protection and the protection of the voters who come, whether
Right.
they're wearing masks or not. But again, that's where the election officials have been able to spend millions of dollars. So I'm not aware of any election officials who are not going to spare any expense to protect their election workers. Because again, without these election workers, our elections, they don't work.
Okay. So I have one thing to say, so to kind of lift our spirits. And and I hope you remember this conversation. You and I, when I did the interview with you, and I'm going to post the interview that we did of you on this chat, but you invited me to come to Leon County, Florida, to witness a citizenship swearing in ceremony where
Yes.
people register to vote. And you said this is one of the most inspiring things that you can witness, to see all these new citizens register to vote. Do you remember you telling me this?
Yes, because in fact, it is one of the most inspiring moments of my professional career. I had the luxury and the honor of attending the federal immigration swearing in service at the federal district court. Every quarter I would come in and you would hear these citizens sing the praises of the United States, why they have chosen. Our court system here in the North Florida Federal District is very generous and essentially would allow every individual that was going through this process to give a statement. And these statements would bring tears to your eyes. To listen to these individuals so proud to be new American citizens, and we would offer them voter registration right off the bat. In fact, what the process was, we'd have the swearing in ceremony. I would leave shortly before the conclusion. When they had the flag ceremony, I would go down to where the judge would be greeting all of the new American citizens at an area that we set up for refreshments, a social event, again, to welcome the Daughters of the American Revolution always sponsored it. And we would register the voters right there. They would get the picture with the judge and then come over and register to vote. But these people were proud to be Americans. And I will tell you, they don't take American citizenship for granted. And I will tell you, that's what I think a lot of Americans take the liberties that we enjoy for granted, and they shouldn't. As again, as someone who is a constitutional student of history, we did not have a lot of the freedoms that we take for granted now. We did not even have them as I was a child. I will tell you, for example, that so many laws have changed within my lifetime. My parents, who were born in Puerto Rico, went to the local hospital. They lived in Queens, New York City in 1950, Annabelle. And they went to Queens County Hospital when my mother's water broke and she had to give birth. When she arrived, she was turned away. My parents were turned away because Puerto Ricans could not be born in Queens County Hospital in New York City. Only whites could be born there. So I proudly can tell people I was born in Harlem Hospital in New York City because Puerto Ricans could be born with the African Americans. And that's a lot of that has changed in America.
Wow.
But again, that's an example in my life that I,
what a story.
This process of understanding, of dealing with the institutional racism that we've made some strides. We have a long way to go. And to me, 2020 is the opportunity to strike a blow against institutional racism that I tell you has not existed since 1968. We had the same choice in 1968.
You know what? I love this story. Yeah, I love the story about you being born in Harlem Hospital because this is what I've been thinking a lot about. First of all, I'm a naturalized citizen. I became citizen when I was 22 and I was sworn in. And it was one of the most powerful experiences I ever went through to actually swear allegiance to the Constitution and the United States because it changed my life. I mean, one of the reasons why I live the way I do and I do what I do is because I feel this commitment to our Constitution and our democracy. that, and I've never sworn to anything before or since. And so I feel completely like focused on this mission to like protect our democracy and our constitution. But here's the thing. Every year, about 750,000 people become citizens of this country. That's a staggering number, okay? And if all those people actually registered to vote and voted, our country would change overnight, you know? And I just think when we get naturalized citizens and immigrants working closely with African American community and the indigenous community, people who are often disenfranchised, people who are often discriminated against, if we all work together, committed to voting, we would change our country dramatically, I think, within an election cycle, you know. But people have to understand that the power that they have, and that's my frustration, is that all the propaganda, all the misinformation is designed to disempower us, make us feel cynical and powerless and helpless and confused and scared, when we have so much power. And that is why they do these things, because we have power and they know it. But we just have to catch up to that and know how much power we have. And so I just really want to emphasize how important it is for naturalized citizens, people like my people, to go out there, register to vote and not let anyone intimidate you. And because you have sworn an oath, okay, like I did. And so we've got to defend this country right now. This is the year. We've got to do it. So anyway, thanks for letting me make that pitch, because just feel so strongly that like immigrants really have to stand up.
Well, not only the immigrants, but again, as I mentioned, those individuals who first, second, and third generation, they are the sons and daughters of immigrants. They are the grandsons and the granddaughters of immigrants. But I will tell you that, again, as a student of American history, we have always done this. It's not different. For example, Benjamin Franklin did not want German Americans to be admitted as citizens to the United States. I'm talking the 1780s. He thought his generation, he was born here. He didn't like those, he called them dark, swarthy. Again, he thought Germans should never be American citizens. And again, you see this in American history all the way through. As every immigrant group came in, the Irish, no. You know, you have those signs in the 1830s and 1840s, no dogs or Irishmen allowed. You know, every new immigrant wave was basically the group that was here saying, oh, enough, you're destroying the nation. Quite frankly, the data is completely opposite. As someone who likes to look at data, the more immigration you allow in, the greater the expansion of our economy. The greatest expansion of small jobs and small businesses is through immigrant populations becoming naturalized citizens. They are the largest small business generator in the United States. And blocking them is like cutting your hands and your feet off. We're doing just the opposite. But we've had this bias. We had the bias against the Asian community. Look at the Chinese Exclusion Act in California. In Arizona, it was illegal for an individual of Asian descent to own property until 1956. This is not something in our far past. We've had these biases built in historically because, again, we're insecure and we're afraid. And we use our fear as a tool, and politicians have been using fear of immigrants as a successful tool as far back as my history of the United States goes. This has been done in the colonial period, the revolutionary period. As a matter of fact, let me tell your listeners, why do we have voter registration laws? Voter registration laws were not designed to safeguard the vote. In fact, you live in a state in which the first voter registration laws were passed, Pennsylvania. They were passed in the 1820s. and they were passed because large number of Dutch and German immigrants were coming in. Now we say the Pennsylvania Dutch and everybody's cool with it. They were despised when they were coming in the 1820s. And the first voter registration laws were designed to keep those German and Dutch immigrants from registering to vote. Voter registration was only in the city of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia to limit those groups from registering and voting. And you can tell that because voter registration under the laws of the state only applied to those two cities. Everybody else in the rest of the state of Pennsylvania, they didn't have to register to vote. It was only the citizens of those two cities. So our application of laws was designed to exclude people, not include people. So we have that residue historically built in the system. And the Republicans who are using that to their advantage, well, that's why the laws were developed initially. And so it has that functionality built into it today.
Well, I am so grateful to you for being such a good teacher, because I remember everything you said back in 2014. I really appreciate how much you care about democracy just in its pure form. And I remember when you were telling me about these ceremonies and how moved you were. And so from one person passionate about democracy to another, thank you. Thank you. And I would love to talk to you again because I know I'm not supposed to be scared. I know you're encouraging me to be courageous, but I get really scared. I'm trying to deal with it. So I would love to talk to you again and maybe kind of go into a deeper dive about like a particular issue. But thank you, Ion. Really, you're like such a hero.
Well, thank you. I'm just doing what I think an American citizen should do. And my own touchstone that I use in my life professionally and personally is Benjamin Franklin, who was asked, leaving the Constitution Hall, which is what we call it now, in 1787, a woman asked him right after those proceedings, because they were all in secret. And actually the only surviving piece of written material from that entire constitutional period is a letter from Benjamin Franklin, which is good reading. But leaving that aside, a woman asked him, "What have you wrought?" And he looked at her and said, "A republic, if you can keep it." Because he knew this process, this government that he established was not something that he didn't know whether it would last. Yeah. The warning that he gave to that woman is the charge that he makes to me, to you, to every one of the people out there. And that is, we were given a republic. It is up to us to keep it. And that's what I'm trying to do. That's all I'm trying to do, Annabelle.
Well, thank you. You're doing a hell of a job. And I will talk to you again soon. Good luck with everything you're doing. Let us know if we can support
Thank you.
you.
Thank you very much.
Let us know how we can support you, because you're doing incredible work. So, okay. I follow you.
Thank you very much. And I will. Okay. All right.
Bye.
You've been listening to Conversations About a Way Forward from Count Me In to Win and The Talk on Main Street. To learn more, find us on Facebook at The Talk on Main Street.